The glass missed my face, but it shattered my daughter's illusion of love. I still remember the sound it made when it hit the wall behind me, the dull thud, the small explosion of red wine across the white wallpaper, and the silence that followed. I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. I just stared at the man who had dared to throw at the man my daughter once called her husband, and wondered how many years of quiet humiliation had led us to this moment. My name is Dolores. I'm 66 years old, and for most of my life, I believed peace was worth more than pride. I thought that silence could keep a family together. But that night at my daughter's wedding anniversary dinner, I learned that sometimes silence is the rope that strangles you slowly while everyone around the table smiles and cuts another slice of cake. We were sitting in the dining room that I had designed myself years ago. I could still remember the day I helped Elena and Mark choose that mahogany table, the same one where he was now pounding his fists. 12 seats, crystal chandelier, silver cutlery gleaming under warm light. Everything perfect except for the people sitting there. My daughter looked beautiful in her emerald dress, the one she said made her feel powerful. But that night, she looked small, fragile, like a child trying to stop a storm by whispering. It started with something simple. I asked a question that shouldn't have mattered. "Elena, you've lost a lot of weight. Are you eating well? I thought it was a mother's concern." Mark made it sound like an insult. Maybe she finally learned not to stuff herself with desserts every time she's upset, he said, laughing, looking around the table for approval. The laughter didn't come. Only the sound of my knife gently hitting the plate. "That's not kind," I said quietly. "A man should protect his wife, not mock her." That was all it took. His eyes narrowed, his smile froze. "Protect her," he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You mean like how you protected your husband? Oh wait, you couldn't even keep him alive." The words sliced through me. The table went silent. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger, but from a pain I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. My husband had died of a heart attack 15 years ago. Mark had just weaponized his death for a cheap laugh. "Elena," I whispered, "are you going to let him talk like that?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Mark's voice grew louder. "You see, Dolores, the problem with you is you think this is still your house, your rules, your perfect little world. It's not. You're just a guest here, an uninvited one." I looked around the table. My son-in-law's friends stared at their plates, pretending not to hear. My daughter's hands were shaking under the tablecloth. I could have stood up. I could have walked away. But instead I asked, "Whose house do you think this is, Mark?" He smirked, poured himself another glass of wine, and said, "Mine. I pay for it. I renovated it. I built this life. You're just here to ruin dinner." Then he threw the glass. Maybe it was meant to scare me. Maybe he missed on purpose. The wine splashed across the wall, sliding down like blood. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. I had seen this before in my father, in men who confused control with strength. I knew then that this wouldn't end with words. I stood up slowly. "Are you finished?" My voice was calm, too calm. It made him angrier. "Don't talk to me like I'm a child," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table, then stopped behaving like one I said. He stepped toward me, his breath sour with alcohol, his face red. "You think you can humiliate me in my own house?" I smiled, and for the first time that night, it was genuine. "If this is your house, Mark, then why do I still pay the property tax?" He froze just for a second, a small flicker of confusion crossing his face. My daughter whispered, "Mom, please." I turned to her. "You've been living in a story, sweetheart, and tonight it just broke." The silence that followed was almost sacred. No one knew what to say. Mark's jaw tightened and he muttered, "You're bluffing." But I didn't answer. I just walked away, leaving the shattered glass behind. In the kitchen, I rinsed my hands under cold water. The red stains swirled down the drain like everything else I'd sacrificed for peace. I could still hear the muffled voices from the dining room. Mark's anger, Elena's tears. It was always the same melody, the same song of excuses. I stared at my reflection in the window. My eyes looked tired, but something inside them was alive again. People think that when you grow old, you become soft, forgetful, fragile. They forget that we remember everything, every look, every insult. Every night we pretended not to hear the shouting through the walls. I remembered it all. And I knew this wasn't the first time he had lost control. 2 weeks earlier, my neighbor had told me she'd seen Mark yelling at Elena outside the gate, gripping her arm too tightly. I didn't want to believe it. My daughter had always defended him, said he was just stressed. But the bruises she tried to hide told me the truth long before she did. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to teach Elena how to write her name. I could still see her little fingers holding the pencil, her laughter filling the room. That memory hurt more than the wine or the words, because I realized she had grown into a woman who had learned to hide her pain exactly as I once did. When she came into the kitchen that night, her mascara was smeared, her voice shaking. "Mommy didn't mean it," she said. "He just gets angry sometimes." I looked at her and asked, "How many times is sometimes, Elena?" She didn't answer. She just sat across from me, hands clutching her napkin like a lifeline. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He's under pressure." From what I asked? From loving you? From having a wife who still tries to make excuses for a man who just threw a glass at her mother? Her tears fell onto the table, small and silent. I reached out and touched her hand. "When your father died, I promised myself I would never let anyone hurt you. I broke that promise the day I stayed silent about the way he talks to you." She looked up confused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying silence ends tonight." She stared at me terrified. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to remind him what happens when a man forgets who owns the roof over his head." Before she could speak, I stood up and walked to the hallway. The air smelled of spilled wine and shame. I could hear Mark still ranting to his friends in the dining room, his words slurred but full of arrogance. "She's nothing but a widow with a pension. She should be grateful we let her stay." I paused by the stairs, letting his words sink in. Every insult was a match, every lie a spark. By the time I reached the top step, I was already on fire, but this time it was the kind of fire that purifies. I went into the small study at the end of the hall and opened the drawer where I kept all the old property documents. The paper smelled of dust and truth. My husband and I had signed that deed 35 years ago. We bought this house before Elena even met Mark. I had never transferred ownership. I had never told them that. As I looked at the signature, my name beside my husband's, I realized that I had spent years pretending to be a guest in my own home just to keep the peace. That peace was now over. I closed the folder, locked the drawer, and whispered to myself, "Tomorrow morning, the real owner of this house will wake up." Then I returned to the dining room. The guests had left. Mark sat slouched in his chair, smirking, swirling another drink. "Back for more?" he asked. I looked at him one last time and said, "You just threw away more than a glass tonight, Mark. You threw away your last chance." He laughed, thinking it was just another one of my motherly warnings. He didn't realize it was a verdict. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the echo of the glass hitting the wall. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake, fully awake for the first time in years. I thought about all the women who keep silent for the sake of family, who swallow their pain because they're told that endurance is love. It's not. It's slow death. I stared at the ceiling, the moonlight tracing lines across the room, and whispered to myself, "Tomorrow he'll learn who he's really living with." And now, if you were me, sitting at that table, watching your son-in-law throw a glass at your face while your daughter stood frozen, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood up? Comment 1. If you would have walked away like I did and like this video, if you think silence can ever be justified. Because for me, that night wasn't the end of dinner. It was the beginning of a reckoning. I used to believe that cruelty always arrived suddenly like a storm that catches you off guard. But the truth is, it seeps in slowly, one drop at a time, until one day you're standing in a flood, wondering when the rain began. That's how it was with Mark. It didn't start with shouting or broken glass. It started with charm. The first time Elena brought him home, he was polite, almost too polite. He stood when I entered the room, offered to wash the dishes, complimented my cooking. "You have such a warm home, Mrs. Alvarez," he said, his smile rehearsed but convincing. I remember thinking he knows how to play people. My husband used to say that a man who smiles too easily often hides something behind his teeth. I should have listened to that voice in my head, but I wanted to see my daughter happy. After her father died, she had locked herself inside a quiet sadness, the kind that doesn't cry but erodes. When Mark came along, she started laughing again. I mistook that noise for healing. The small cracks began to appear after their engagement. He would make jokes about how old-fashioned I was. At first they sounded harmless. You still write grocery lists on paper. That's adorable, then you still drive that antique car. Must be hard for the neighbors not to call the museum. Each comment stung a little, but I swallowed the sting. That's what mothers do, right? We swallow hurt so our children can breathe easier. One night, while Elena was out shopping for wedding decorations, Mark stopped by my house unannounced. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when he walked in without knocking, holding a folder. "I need your signature," he said casually. "For what?" I asked, wiping my hands. "It's just a small document Elena said you'd co-sign for the venue. We'll pay you back after the wedding." He spoke fast, too fast, like a salesman who didn't want questions. I took the folder and opened it. It wasn't a co-signing form. It was a partial ownership transfer for my late husband's land. He had written the address in small print, maybe hoping I wouldn't notice. I closed the folder and looked up. His eyes met mine, calm but cold. "I think you brought the wrong papers," I said. His smile didn't falter. "You're sharp, Mrs. Alvarez. I like that. But let's be realistic, this land isn't doing you any good. You could use the money, right? Elena told me you're on a fixed income." That was the first time I realized he had been digging into my finances using my daughter as a key. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked to the door, opened it, and said, "Leave before I forget that I'm a lady." He left laughing softly as if it were all a misunderstanding. But his laughter followed me long after the door closed. When Elena came home that night, I told her what happened. She looked shocked at first, then embarrassed. "Mommy probably just made a mistake. You know how he is with paperwork." I wanted to believe her, but the lie in her tone was too gentle, too rehearsed. She wasn't defending him. She was protecting her illusion. A few weeks later, another sign appeared. I had come over to visit and found Mark in the living room with a group of his friends. They were all in expensive suits, drinking whiskey and laughing loudly. As soon as I walked in, the laughter stopped. One of the men stood awkwardly. Mark didn't. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward me, "this is my mother-in-law. She's the one who still believes real estate is about family, not profit." They laughed again, this time at me. I wanted to disappear, not because of shame, but because I suddenly understood my place in his world, the old relic he could parade around for entertainment. That night, I sat on the porch swing long after they'd gone, staring at the streetlights flickering outside. Every insult, every subtle mockery was building a wall between me and my daughter, and I didn't know how to tear it down without breaking her heart. But the moment that sealed my doubt came a month after their wedding. I was in the living room cleaning up after Sunday lunch. Mark was on the couch watching TV, his shoes still on crumbs on the carpet. "Would you mind helping me with the dishes?" I asked. He didn't even look at me. "You're good at that, Dolores. It's what you do best." Something about the way he said it, flat dismissive, made my stomach twist. "Excuse me," I asked. He turned the volume down just enough for me to hear the next words clearly. "You act like you're part of this family, but really you're just background noise." I stood there, frozen plate in hand. I wanted to shout to tell him he had no right. But then Elena came in, smiling, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You two getting along?" she asked cheerfully. I saw the quick shift in Mark's expression, the instant transformation. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Your mom was just saying how lovely lunch was." She looked at me, hopeful, fragile, and in that split second, I lied. Yes, it was. Later that night, after they went to bed, I sat alone on that same couch, the TV still humming softly. The air smelled like leftover perfume and deceit. That's when I made a quiet promise to myself I would stop pretending, but I also knew I needed to wait. You can't confront a snake when it's coiled. You wait until it slithers into the open. A few days later, I got my chance. I was dusting the bookshelf in the living room when I noticed one of my old ledgers missing. It was a small brown notebook where I used to record payments, expenses, and rental income from a property I had inherited from my parents. I hadn't touched it in years. When I asked Elena, she looked confused. Mark overheard and said, "Oh, I took that. I thought it was just an old diary. Didn't realize you were still hoarding receipts." My pulse quickened. That ledger contained information about the building I owned downtown, the one whose rent money I quietly used to help Elena during college. I smiled, pretending not to notice the panic under his casual tone. "It's fine," I said. "Just make sure it doesn't get lost." That night, I checked the small safe in my closet. Nothing was missing, but I knew what he was doing. He was mapping my finances, studying my assets, measuring how much he could control once I was gone. From that night on, I started paying attention. I wrote down every comment, every question he asked, every bill he offered to handle for me. It was like watching termites chew through a house one beam at a time. He didn't just want my daughter's loyalty. He wanted my silence, my stability, my legacy. When you reach my age, people think you're slow, that you miss details. But aging is not the same as ignorance. It's seeing the same patterns return in different faces. I had seen men like Mark before my father, my brother-in-law, even some of my late husband's business partners. Men who smiled at dinner and stole while you were serving dessert. I kept waiting for Elena to see it too, but love can blind even the smartest eyes. She was convinced Mark was simply ambitious. Every red flag became a compliment in her language. When he ignored her, she said he was focused. When he snapped at me, she said he was tired. I realized then that the real battle wasn't between me and Mark. It was between my truth and my daughter's denial. And that was the first time I felt real fear, not for myself, but for her. I remember sitting by the window that night, watching the streetlights blink through the fog and whispering to the dark, "He's going to destroy her if I don't stop him." What I didn't know yet was that the destruction had already begun, and that soon the next drop in the storm would turn into a flood that no one could ignore. It was a Thursday afternoon when the first undeniable crack appeared in Mark's perfect image. I was watering the rose bushes outside when my neighbor, Clara, leaned over the fence with that look that always meant she had something to say, but wasn't sure if she should. Clara was one of those women who had seen everything widowed young, raised 2 boys, and carried more truth in her eyes than she ever said aloud. "Dolores." She began softly, "I didn't want to tell you this, but I think you should know. I saw Mark yesterday downtown. He wasn't alone. At first I thought she must be mistaken. Are you sure it was him?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. She nodded slowly. "I've known that man's car since your daughter's wedding. Black BMW tinted windows, but he left the window cracked. I saw him at Cafe Lumen with a woman young, maybe 30, blonde. They looked close." I didn't speak for several seconds. The water from the hose spilled onto the soil, turning it to mud. "Did you tell Elena?" I asked finally. "No," she said gently. "I thought it should come from you." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk with the lamp on low, staring at the framed photo of Elena and Mark from their honeymoon. They looked so happy, his arm around her waist, her smile bright and unguarded. I remembered how she had called me every day that week, telling me how wonderful he was. And now all I could hear in my mind was Clara's voice. They looked close. I didn't want to accuse him without proof. I'd learned the hard way that truth when spoken too soon can sound like jealousy. So I waited. The next morning I told Elena I wanted to visit the flower market downtown. It wasn't a lie, I just took a detour. Cafe Lumen sat on the corner of Pine Street, a small glass-fronted place filled with the smell of roasted coffee and expensive secrets. I parked across the street and waited. He arrived at 12:47, right on time, wearing the same gray suit he'd worn the day before. But it wasn't his suit that caught my eye. It was the woman who followed him inside. She was tall, young, dressed in a red dress, too bright for daylight. They didn't sit across from each other. They sat side by side, bodies, leaning close, shoulders touching. When she laughed, he reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my stomach twist, not from surprise, but from confirmation. The lies I'd suspected were now real, breathing right there through the cafe window. I took out my phone, hesitated, and snapped 2 photos. One of them laughing, another of his hand on her thigh. Proof undeniable but heavy like lead in my hand. When I returned home that afternoon, Elena was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She looked tired, distracted, stirring the pot without really seeing it. "You look pale, Mom," she said. "Everything okay?" I wanted to scream the truth right then. No, everything's not okay. Your husband is having lunch with another woman? But instead, I asked, has Mark been working late again? She nodded. Almost every night this week. He's been under a lot of pressure with the company merger. Then she smiled weakly. But he'll get through it. He always does. Her faith in him was painful to watch. I thought about the photo on my phone, how easily it could destroy the illusion she was clinging to. But part of me hesitated. I wanted her to see it herself, to recognize the truth without me being the messenger. So I waited again. 2 days later, fate did the work for me. Clara stopped by with a worried look. Dolores. There's something else, she said, lowering her voice. The woman he was with, I saw her again, but this time she was outside your house, in his car. I felt a chill run through me when I asked. Last night around 11, they parked a few houses down. I thought maybe she was lost until I saw him walk her to the car, kiss her, and send her off. My breath caught in my throat. 11 o'clock. That was the same time Elena had called me crying because Mark hadn't come home yet. She said he was working late. That night, I watched from my bedroom window. His car pulled up past midnight headlights, sweeping across the driveway like an accusation. When he walked inside, his tie was loose, his shirt slightly unbuttoned. He didn't look like a man who had been working. He looked like a man who thought he could get away with anything. The next morning, over breakfast, I tried one last time to reach Elena. Sweetheart, can I ask you something? She looked up from her coffee, wary. Does Mark ever tell you where he goes after work? Her expression tightened. Why? I just noticed he's been coming home late. You deserve to know if he's... She cut me off sharply. He's not doing anything wrong, Mom. Don't start this again. Again, I asked. When have I ever... You've never liked him, she snapped. You've been waiting for him to slip up since the day we got married. You think every man is like Dad, perfect and loyal. But life doesn't work like that. Her words hit me harder than the wine glass ever did. Elena, I said quietly, this isn't about me. It's about respect. The way he talks to you, the way he... Enough, she shouted, slamming her cup down. Coffee spilled across the table, dark and bitter. Just stop trying to ruin my marriage. For a moment, we just stared at each other, two women standing on opposite sides of the same pain. Then she stood, grabbed her purse, and left. The front door closed like a final verdict. I sat there for a long time, listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock. I'd lost her, at least for now. The more I tried to protect her, the more she clung to the man who was destroying her. It's strange how love can make you deaf to warnings, blind to bruises, numb to humiliation. Later that day, I received a text message from an unknown number. No words, just a picture. It was the same woman from the cafe, this time standing beside Mark in a parking garage. They were kissing. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. The message came from a private number, but I knew who it was. Someone who wanted me to know, maybe even wanted Elena to know. I printed the photo and placed it in an envelope addressed to my daughter, but I didn't send it. Instead, I kept it in my drawer, waiting. That night, Mark came home late again. I was in the living room pretending to read. He walked past me without saying a word, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't Elena's. I looked up from the book and said, "You should wash that scent off before she notices." He froze in the doorway. "What did you say?" I met his eyes. "You heard me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You think you can threaten me with your little suspicions. You think she'll believe you over me. You're just a lonely old woman living off her dead husband's money." I closed the book slowly, keeping my voice steady. "You're right about one thing, Mark. I am old. Old enough to know that truth doesn't need belief to exist." He smirked and left the room, but I could tell my calmness unsettled him. He didn't know that I had already seen everything, that I had proof hidden in a drawer upstairs, waiting for the moment his arrogance would expose him completely. That night, I stood by my window, again the same spot where I had once watched my husband come home late from work, always tired, but always faithful. The city lights flickered on the horizon, and I whispered to the dark, "You can lie to her, Mark, but you can't lie to me forever." I didn't know how soon forever would end or how violently the truth would tear through our lives. But I did know one thing for certain. The next time he raised his hand or his voice, he wouldn't just be breaking glass. He'd be breaking his own reflection. The distance between my daughter and me didn't happen overnight. It stretched slowly like a rubber band you don't notice, tightening until it snaps. After the fight in the kitchen, Elena stopped calling every day. She stopped asking me to join her for lunch, stopped dropping by after work. When I called, she always sounded rushed. "Sorry, Mom, Mark's got a big project." We're both exhausted. It was the kind of tone people use when they're hiding something behind politeness. Weeks passed like that, quiet, strange, heavy. When I did see her, she looked thinner, paler. Her eyes didn't shine the same way. I tried not to push. Every mother knows that the harder you pull, the further your child drifts away. So I waited. I busied myself with my garden, my book club, my walks around the neighborhood, but even silence can scream when you know what it's trying to hide. Then came the invitation. Mom Elena said over the phone one evening, her voice forced and cheerful, "Mark's planning a small dinner next weekend. It's our 10th anniversary. He wants you there." The words felt strange in my ear. Mark wanting me anywhere near a dinner table was like a wolf inviting the shepherd to supper. Still, I agreed. "Of course," I said softly. "Tell him I'll bring the dessert." The week before the dinner, little signs began to surface. My calls went unanswered, my texts left on read. Clara told me she'd seen Elena crying in the driveway one night. She looked terrified, Clara whispered, like someone who's trapped in her own home. The morning of the dinner, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I wore the navy blue dress my husband used to love, simple but elegant. I tied my hair in a loose bun and looked at myself with a mix of strength and sorrow. Tonight I whispered to my reflection, "You don't shrink. You don't bow. You show them who you are." The house looked different when I arrived, brighter, louder, but emptier somehow. Music played softly in the background, and guests were scattered through the living room with champagne glasses and polite laughter. Mark was in the center, confident, charismatic, performing the role he knew so well. He greeted me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mother Dolores, you made it," he said, his voice thick with false warmth. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten the address." "I could never forget something that used to belong to me," I said evenly. His smile faltered for half a second, then returned tighter this time. Elena rushed over and hugged me. "Mom, you look beautiful," she whispered. Her hands were cold. When she pulled back, I noticed faint marks on her wrist. She followed my gaze and quickly covered them with her sleeve. My heart sank, but I said nothing. Dinner was served at 7. 12 people around that long table, and went again like ghosts, replaying a scene that was doomed to end the same way. The meal started politely enough, small talk, laughter, glasses clinking. Mark told stories about business deals, bragged about his car, his clients, his upcoming promotion. Everyone nodded, smiled, indulged him. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You know, Dolores, I should thank you. If it weren't for your generation, ours wouldn't have such low standards to improve upon." The table went quiet for a beat before forced laughter filled the air. I looked around. No one dared meet my eyes. I could have ignored it like I always did, but something inside me shifted that night. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the exhaustion of swallowing my pride for too long. I set down my fork and said, "I'm glad you think so highly of yourself, Mark. It must be exhausting keeping up with your own ego." The laughter stopped again, but this time it didn't return. Elena's eyes widened. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Careful," he said, quietly. "You're in my house." "Am I?" I asked. "That's funny. Last time I checked, ownership doesn't change just because someone hangs new curtains." Elena whispered, "Mom, please," but I couldn't stop. I'd been silent for too long. Mark's smile vanished completely. "You're drunk," he said flatly. "I haven't had a sip," I replied. He leaned forward, voice dropping low so only I could hear. "You're old, bitter, and lonely. That's why you can't stand seeing your daughter happy." I met his eyes. If happiness means living in fear, then you've redefined the word beautifully. The air went cold. I saw his jaw clench, his hand gripping the wine glass tighter, and then like lightning it happened. The glass flew across the table, spinning through the air. It missed my face by an inch and smashed against the wall behind me. Red wine splattered like blood across the wallpaper. Gasps filled the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just stared at him. He stood there breathing hard, realizing too late that he had exposed himself. Elena's hands trembled on the table. "Mark," she whispered, "what did you just do?" He stammered, "She provoked me. You saw how she—" "No," she said, voice breaking, "I saw you." For a moment I thought she would walk out, but fear won again. She grabbed a napkin, began cleaning the table as if wiping away the evidence. "It's fine," she said mechanically. "It's just wine." I looked at her, my heart cracking open. "No, Elena," I said softly. "It's never just wine." I rose from the table. My cheek was warm from the near miss, but my voice was steady. "You can throw glass, Mark. You can throw words. But one day, something's going to hit you back and it won't miss." The guests sat frozen. No one dared move. I turned to leave, and that's when Mark muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ungrateful old woman, living off my charity." I stopped at the doorway, turned my head slightly, and said, "Charity, my dear, you wouldn't even have a roof over your head if it weren't for my signature." A murmur rippled through the guests. I saw confusion flash across their faces, and for the first time that night, Mark looked unsure. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. But I didn't answer. I simply walked out my heels, clicking against the marble floor, leaving a trail of silence behind me. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, like a slap that finally wakes you up. I stood in the driveway, breathing deeply, my hands trembling. The sky was full of stars, but I couldn't feel their light. I thought about Elena still inside that house, still trapped in the web he'd spun around her. I thought about the years I'd spent pretending the patience I'd called love. When I reached my car, I leaned against it and let out a long, shaky breath. Clara's house was just across the street. Her porch light was still on. As if she'd been waiting, she opened the door and called softly, "Dolores." I walked toward her, trying to hold myself together. She saw my face and didn't ask questions. She just led me inside, poured me a cup of chamomile tea, and said he finally showed who he really is, didn't he? I nodded. He threw a glass. She sighed. "Then it's time." "Time for what?" "For you to stop letting them make you small." I looked down at the tea steam curling upward like ghosts of all the words I'd never said. He thinks he owns everything her that house, even me. But he's wrong. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm going to remind him who built that house brick by brick, who paid for every inch of that life he's living." Clara smiled faintly. "Now that's the Dolores I remember." That night when I returned home, I sat at my kitchen table. The same table where my husband once taught me to read contracts, to never sign anything without understanding every line. His voice echoed in my mind. "Paper is power, Dolores. Keep yours safe." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the old folder with the property deed. My hands didn't shake this time. The name on that paper mine felt like a heartbeat. I placed it flat on the table, whispered, "You wanted a war mark. You just declared it." Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. When the familiar voice answered, I said, "James, it's me. I need you to prepare some documents. We're transferring ownership quietly tonight." He hesitated. "Are you sure, Mrs. Alvarez?" "Completely," I said. "And James, make sure the first person to receive the notice tomorrow morning is Mark Alvarez. I want him to wake up and see whose house he's been living in." As I hung up, the clock struck midnight. I felt no fear, no anger, only clarity. The woman who left that dinner table wasn't the same one who sat down to it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the house. It was strange how silence could feel heavier than shouting. I could still hear the glass breaking, still see the look on my daughter's face. Shock, fear, something else too. Shame, maybe, or realization, the kind that comes too late. The moonlight cut through the blinds and fell across the deed papers I had left on the nightstand. I ran my fingers over the signature, the one I had written 35 years ago when my husband and I bought that house. I could still smell the ink, still remember the pride in his eyes when he said, "This will be for Elena one day, a home built on respect." How bitterly ironic that it had turned into a cage of humiliation. I thought about him all night, my husband. His calm, his strength. He'd always believed in fairness and dignity. He used to tell me, "Dolores, the world only takes what you allow it to." For years, I thought I was protecting my daughter by allowing things to stay calm, by staying quiet. But I understood now that silence doesn't protect anyone. It feeds monsters. By dawn, I was done crying. My tears had dried into resolve. I took a shower dressed in gray slacks and a cream blouse, tied my hair neatly, and packed the deed into a folder. As I walked to the kitchen, the first rays of sun touched the garden through the window. The roses I'd planted were blooming again, red and defiant, as if mocking my weakness. I took it as a sign. When I arrived at the law office, James was already waiting. He was in his late 50s now, grayer than I remembered, but his eyes still had that sharp, quiet intelligence that made him one of the best in town. He rose when I entered, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Dolores," he said, "you look like a woman who's made up her mind." "I have," I replied, handing him the folder. "I want to transfer ownership of the house to a new trust, one that Mark can't touch. Not now, not ever." He adjusted his glasses and flipped through the documents carefully. "It's still in your name, as I advised years ago," he said, nodding approvingly. "You never added Elena or Mark as co-owners. That makes this simple." "Good," I said. "Then let's make it official." He studied me for a moment, then asked gently, "What happened?" I hesitated. My instinct was to downplay it, to say it was a misunderstanding, but the words came out raw and unfiltered. He threw a glass at me. "James, in front of my daughter, in my own house." His face darkened. "You want to press charges?" "Not yet," I said. "I don't want revenge. I want clarity. I want them both to see exactly what they've been living on." He nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll draw up the documents. We can finalize everything today." It took 3 hours. Paperwork, signatures, notarization. Each pen stroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When we finished, James looked up and said, "By Monday morning, they'll receive legal notice. The property belongs to the Alvarez Trust, controlled solely by you. If Mark tries to sell rent or refinance, the system will flag it immediately." I smiled faintly. "Perfect. That will ruin his weekend." James leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Dolores, I've known you a long time. This isn't just about property, is it?" I met his gaze. "No, it's about ending the lie I've been living in." He sighed. "Be careful. Men like him don't surrender gracefully." "I don't need him to surrender," I said quietly. "I just need him to see himself without the mask." When I walked out of the building, the morning had turned crisp, the sky bluer than it had been in weeks. I took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to freedom. I stopped at the florist on my way home. The owner, a kind old man named Miguel, greeted me with his usual warmth. "Mrs. Alvarez, you haven't been here in a while, huh?" I smiled. "I'm celebrating a new beginning, Miguel. I need a bouquet, something bold." He handed me a bunch of red and white lilies. "These stand for truth and courage," he said. I nodded. "Exactly what I need." When I reached home, I saw Elena's car already in the driveway. My heart skipped. She was sitting on the porch, her hair unkempt, eyes swollen. She looked up as I approached, and I knew she hadn't slept either. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I set the flowers down and sat beside her. "Of course." She hesitated, biting her lip. "He told me what happened. He said you provoked him." I didn't answer. I just looked at her. She took a deep breath. "But I saw the wall this morning, Mom. The wine stains the broken glass. I know what that looks like." I reached for her hand. "Sweetheart, you don't have to protect him." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm not. I don't know what to do. He says he loves me, that it was a mistake, that he's under stress." "Love doesn't throw things," I said gently. "Love doesn't make you afraid to breathe." She covered her face with her hands and sobbed quietly. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the weight of years melt into that one fragile moment. "I thought I could fix him," she whispered. "You can't fix someone who doesn't think he's broken," I said, "but you can save yourself." She lifted her head slowly. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," I said firmly, "because you're my daughter, and you come from a line of women who don't stay silent forever." We sat like that for a while until her breathing steadied. Then I stood and said, "Go home, rest. Tomorrow will be different." She frowned. "What's happening tomorrow?" "Let's just say," I said with a small smile, "your husband's going to get some mail he won't enjoy." She tried to smile, but failed. "Mom, please don't do anything drastic." "I'm not," I assured her. "I'm just setting the record straight." After she left, I went inside, placed the lilies in a vase, and cleaned the kitchen in silence. The house felt lighter somehow, as if it knew what was coming. At noon, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with a thick envelope addressed to Mark Alvarez. Legal papers stamped and sealed. I signed for them knowing he would open them in a few hours and realize his world wasn't as secure as he thought. That evening, I received a message from Clara. "He's home early. Looks furious." I smiled faintly and texted back, "Let him be. The truth always hits harder than glass." As the sun set, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the first stars appear. Through the open window, I could hear my husband's old record playing softly, the song we used to dance to in the living room. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the music wrap around me like memory. Then my phone buzzed. It was Elena. "He's yelling, Mom. He got the letter." I typed back, "Don't argue. Just leave the house and come to me." Half an hour later, she arrived, eyes red, clutching her purse. "He said you're trying to ruin us," she cried. I guided her inside, poured her water, and said calmly, "No, dear, I'm saving us." She looked at me confused. How? Because now he knows he's been living in my house under my roof, funded by my money. And soon, the only thing he'll have left is the echo of his own arrogance. She stared at me speechless. "You really did it." "I did," I said. "And if he dares raise his voice again, I'll make sure he never works in this city again." That night, as she fell asleep on my couch, I stood by the window and watched the lights flicker from across the street. Mark's silhouette moved furiously inside, pacing back and forth. I imagined him opening drawer after drawer, searching for a sense of control he'd already lost. I imagined him realizing that every luxury he'd flaunted, every car payment, every loan, every penny had been made possible by me. By midnight, the street was silent again. I whispered into the darkness, "Let him rage. Tomorrow the world will know who he really is." The next morning, a police car appeared briefly in front of his house. Not for an arrest, but for a welfare check. Someone, maybe a neighbor, had reported shouting. He came out in a robe, humiliated, angry, waving his arms at the officers. I watched from behind my curtain, sipping my coffee. The officers left after a few minutes, but the humiliation stayed. He had built his image so carefully, and now the cracks were public. Later that day, I received a call from James. "It's done," he said. "The documents are finalized. Legally, you have full control of the estate. He can't contest it without your consent." I thanked him quietly. "James," I said, before hanging up, "sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs the right signature." That evening, Elena sat beside me on the couch, still in shock, but calmer. "What's going to happen now?" she asked. "Nothing immediate," I said. "He'll deny, he'll bargain. He'll try to make you choose. But when a man like that realizes the ground he's standing on doesn't belong to him, he eventually falls on his own." She nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheeks. "You were right, Mom. I didn't want to see it." I took her hand and said softly, "Seeing is the hardest part. But now you can heal." We sat in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the distance, I could still hear faint shouting from across the street, a man realizing that the empire he'd built was made of paper and lies. As the stars came out, I whispered to my husband's photo on the mantel. "I kept your promise, love. I protected her, and I didn't stay silent." That night, I slept soundly for the first time in years. The battle wasn't over yet, but the war had shifted. The victim had become the author, and tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. The morning after felt strange, as if the air itself had changed weight. I woke to the smell of coffee and the soft hum of Elena moving quietly in the kitchen. She looked different, tired, yes, but also lighter, as though some invisible chain around her chest had been loosened during the night. She handed me a cup and said softly, "He didn't come home." I nodded, good. She blinked, startled by the calmness in my voice. "Mom, what if he does something stupid?" "He already has," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Now he's just dealing with the consequences." For a long time, we sat in silence, the kind that feels like two people learning how to breathe in the same room again. Then I reached across the table and took her hand. "Sweetheart, I need you to understand something," I began. "This isn't about revenge, it's about dignity, about teaching a man who's built his power on fear that he never actually had any." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "He'll hate you for this." I smiled faintly. "Let him. Hatred doesn't scare me anymore. Silence does." After breakfast, I went to the study. The light coming through the window was soft golden, the kind of light that makes you think of beginnings. I opened my drawer and took out the small box my husband had left me years ago. Inside were letters, financial papers, and a silver locket with our wedding date engraved. I hadn't touched it in years, but now it felt like a piece of armor. I called James again. "I want to make sure everything's airtight," I said. "No loopholes, no way for him to contest." "It's done," he replied. "But there's something else you should know. When the property transfer hit the public registry this morning, it became visible to anyone running a credit search. If Mark tries to use the house as collateral, he'll find out immediately that he owns nothing." I smiled. That's exactly what I want him to discover. "And Dolores," he added gently, "if you ever decide to press charges for what happened, you have witnesses." The guests at that dinner, they saw everything. "I know," I said. "But right now, humiliation is punishment enough. Let him taste what he fed others." After I hung up, I looked out the window. The street was quiet. Birds pecked at the grass, the world going on as if nothing monumental had just shifted. But inside, everything had changed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's story. I was writing the next chapter myself. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. It was Clara holding a newspaper and a mischievous smile. "You might want to see this," she said. I unfolded the paper. There it was, an article about Mark's company. "Scandal in local investment firm. Allegations of mismanagement surface." His name wasn't mentioned directly, but anyone who knew the business world could read between the lines. "He's been playing risky," Clara said. "Word is he's been losing investors left and right." I set the paper down. "So the empire's cracking faster than I expected." Clara leaned closer. "Dolores, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But be careful. Men like him panic when they start to lose control." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not panicking at all." That afternoon, I decided to visit the place that had once given me strength, the cemetery where my husband was buried. The wind was soft, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the nearby trees. I knelt by his grave, brushed away a few fallen leaves, and whispered, "I did it, love. I took back the house. I kept our promise." I stayed there for a long time, talking to him the way I always did when the world felt too loud. "You'd be proud of Elena," I said. "She's starting to see. She's scared, but she's opening her eyes." I touched the locket at my neck, feeling the familiar weight. He thought he could break me, but all he did was remind me who I am. When I returned home, I found Elena sitting on the porch steps holding an envelope. Her face was pale. "He sent this," she said quietly, handing it to me. Inside was a letter, in his handwriting, angry, chaotic, dripping with accusation. "You've destroyed everything, Dolores. You've poisoned my wife against me, stolen what's rightfully ours. I will not forget this." I folded the paper neatly and handed it back. "Keep it," I said. "You'll need it one day when you file for divorce." She stared at me, shocked. "You really think it's over?" It was over the moment he chose violence over words. That night, I sat on my porch with Clara again. The air smelled of rain, thick and electric. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" she teased. "Constantly," I said with a dry smile. "But it's better than being blind." She handed me a small flash drive. "I thought you might want this. My nephew works in tech. He pulled footage from your neighbor's security camera. It caught everything that night." My breath caught. Everything. From the moment he threw the glass to when you walked out. I took the flash drive carefully as if it were fragile glass. "Thank you, Clara. This is insurance." "Insurance or ammunition?" she asked with a smirk. "Maybe both." The next day, I took the drive to James's office. He watched the footage in silence, his expression hardening with each second. When it ended, he exhaled sharply. "This is more than enough for a restraining order, Dolores, and if you want, we can use it in a civil case for emotional and physical endangerment." "Not yet," I said again. "Timing is everything." Right now, I want him to twist in uncertainty. Let him wonder how much I know. James nodded. "You're playing this smarter than most people half your age." "I've had decades to practice patience," I said. "It's about time it paid off." When I left his office, I stopped by the grocery store. As I walked through the aisles, I caught whispers, two women near the produce section, talking in low voices. "Did you hear about Mark Alvarez, Heard? He's been kicked out of his house. Serves him right. My husband says he's been bragging for years about deals that don't exist. Arrogant men always fall the loudest." I pretended not to listen, but inside I felt something sharp and satisfying twist loose. Not joy, just justice. By evening, the rumors had spread further than I expected. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I hope you're proud of yourself." I smiled at the screen. "More than you'll ever be," I replied, then blocked the number. Elena came home late that night. She looked shaken. "He showed up at my work," she said, her voice trembling. "He tried to make a scene, said you tricked him. My boss had to ask him to leave." I stood heart pounding but voice steady. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she said quickly. "But everyone saw. I'm so embarrassed." I cupped her face gently. "Sweetheart, shame belongs to those who do wrong, not to those who endure it. Remember that." She nodded slowly, and for the first time I saw the spark of resolve in her eyes. I told him not to come back. I think he finally realized I mean it. I smiled. Good. Now let's make sure he doesn't have anywhere to come back to. That weekend, I met James one final time to sign an additional document and eviction notice in case Mark refused to vacate. "It's just a precaution," he said, sliding the paper across the desk. "I like precautions," I replied, signing without hesitation. By Sunday evening, the storm finally broke. Literally and figuratively, rain lashed the windows as thunder rolled through the valley. I sat in the living room, the same room where he once mocked me, and listened to the storm roar like applause. Then my phone buzzed again. This time a call from Clara. "He's outside," she said. "He's been standing in the rain for half an hour yelling your name." I looked out the window. There he was. Mark soaked, furious, a silhouette of ruin. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the thunder. For a moment I felt a flicker of pity. Then I remembered the wine glass, the bruises on Elena's wrists, the years of silence I'd mistaken for peace. I opened the door but didn't step out. "You should leave, Mark," I called out over the rain. He laughed bitterly. "You think you've won. You think you can take everything from me." I shook my head. I didn't take anything. I just stopped giving. He stared at me, jaw-tight, rain dripping from his hair. "You'll regret this." "No," I said softly. "I've regretted enough. It's your turn now." He took a step forward, but the flash of headlights pulled both our eyes toward the street Elena's car. She stepped out, umbrella in hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "Go home, Mark," she said. "This is my home," he yelled. She looked at him calm but final. "No, it's hers." He froze the truth, landing heavier than the rain. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away into the storm. Elena turned to me, eyes shining with tears, but also something fierce recognition, maybe even pride. "You were right," she said quietly. "Some people only learn through loss." I pulled her close, both of us drenched from the rain, and whispered, "Loss isn't always a punishment, sweetheart. Sometimes it's just freedom in disguise." That night, as the storm faded and the house grew quiet again, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Not triumph, not even relief, just peace. The kind that comes after you've reclaimed your voice. Tomorrow, I knew there would be paperwork, phone calls, maybe even gossip. But tonight, there was only the sound of rain washing the last traces of fear from my life. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and whispered to the darkness, "He took my peace. Now I've taken his certainty." And somewhere out there, in the night, I knew he finally understood that underestimating a woman like me was the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. It was almost midnight when I heard the knock. Not a polite tap, but a hard, impatient pounding that made the windows tremble. I had been sitting by the fireplace, half reading, half listening to the soft ticking of the clock. The house was quiet. Elena asleep upstairs, the storm from the night before, now just a memory. The pounding came again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. You can feel the presence of anger long before you see its face. I rose slowly, set my book down, and walked to the door. The night beyond the glass was thick and black, the porch light casting a small halo on his soaked figure. Mark. He looked wrecked. His suit was rumpled hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wild from lack of sleep or maybe from losing control. "Open the door," he demanded, his voice muffled through the rain. I didn't move. "It's late, Mark." "Open the damn door." Behind me, I heard Elena's footsteps from the stairs. "Mom, what's going on?" she whispered. "Go back upstairs," I said quietly. "This is between him and me." She hesitated, eyes wide. "No, Mom. Please, Elena." My voice was calm, steady, the way a mother's voice is when she wants her child to know there's nothing to fear. Reluctantly, she turned and went upstairs, leaving me alone in the glow of the hall light. I took a slow breath, unlocked the door, and opened it halfway. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, tracking rainwater onto the hardwood floor. "We need to talk," he said. "Then talk." He looked around the room, scanning the walls as if searching for something to hold on to. "You've ruined everything. Do you even realize what you've done?" "The bank froze my accounts this morning. Investors are pulling out. My name is being dragged through the mud because of that article." "Sounds like consequences, not coincidences," I said. He turned on me, eyes flashing. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said evenly. "I think it's fair." He moved closer, his presence heavy, suffocating. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Sitting here in this house that's not even yours anymore. You've poisoned Elena against me, made me look like a monster." I met his gaze. "You did that all by yourself." For a moment, the only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing like a caged animal. "You don't understand how this works, Dolores. You don't just take power from a man like me. You can't." I tilted my head slightly. I already did. His jaw tightened. "You think that piece of paper means anything fine. You own the house. Congratulations. But you can't control Elena. She's still my wife." I smiled faintly, for now. That hit him. I could see it in the twitch of his mouth, the small fracture in his arrogance. "You can't turn her against me," he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "She's turning herself," I said softly. "She's starting to remember who she was before you rewrote her story." He laughed bitterly. "You really think she'll leave me after everything I've given her?" I stepped closer, close enough to smell the sharp tang of whiskey on his breath. "You didn't give her anything, Mark. You borrowed her life and called it love." He took a step back as if my words had physical weight. "You're pathetic," he spat. "A bitter old widow clinging to control because you have nothing else." I studied him for a moment. "You know what's funny about power, Mark? It doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the one who doesn't need to shout." His face twisted in rage. "You think you've won?" "This isn't a game," I said. "It's reality catching up." He moved suddenly, slamming his hand against the wall beside me. The sound was sharp, echoing through the hall. "You think I won't fight back?" I didn't flinch. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Try." For a moment, we just stood there, two statues in the storm's aftermath. Then slowly, I reached for the small remote on the side table and pressed a button. A faint beep sounded, followed by the quiet hum of playback. From the speaker came his voice, angry, cruel, familiar. "You're old, bitter, and lonely. That's why you can't stand seeing your daughter happy." The recording filled the silence between us. He froze. "What is that?" he demanded. "Insurance," I said calmly. "I told you once that truth doesn't need belief to exist. Now it has proof." His face went pale. "You recorded me." "No," I said. "The camera across the street did. Clara's nephew gave me the footage. Every second of your performance at the dinner, the glass, the threats. It's all there." He blinked, stunned. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would," I interrupted. "And if you ever set foot in this house again without permission, every lawyer in this city will have a copy by morning." He stared at me, jaw tight, chest heaving. "You think you're untouchable?" "No," I said softly. "I think I've learned how to stop letting people touch what's mine." He took another step back, then laughed. But it wasn't real laughter. It was the broken sound of a man who'd run out of moves. "You've planned this all along, haven't you?" I shook my head. "No, you planned it for me. Every insult, every act of cruelty, every night I stayed silent while you tore her down, you built this ending." "Mark, I just wrote it down." He turned toward the door, gripping the handle, but stopped. "You'll regret this, Dolores. You and Elena both. I'll make sure of it." I took a slow step forward. "No, Mark, you won't." He turned slightly, eyes narrowing. "Because this conversation," I said, gesturing toward the small device on the table, "is being recorded too." His expression flickered confusion, anger, then realization. "You wouldn't dare." I smiled the kind of smile my husband used to call quiet thunder. "Try me." For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. The air between us felt charged, brittle, one wrong word away from breaking. I could see his mind racing, searching for a way to regain control, but there was nothing left for him to grip. He turned toward the door again, muttering under his breath. "You're crazy," I said quietly. "No, I'm awake." He opened the door and stepped out into the rain. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. "You think you've saved her," he said, "but she'll hate you for this. You'll end up alone." I met his gaze without blinking. Maybe, but I'd rather be alone in peace than surrounded by poison. He hesitated for a second longer, then slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, final and satisfying like a full stop at the end of a long, painful sentence. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I walked to the table, stopped the recording, and set the device beside the folder of legal documents. A strange calm filled me. It wasn't triumph, it was release. I went upstairs to check on Elena. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, wide awake, eyes glistening. I heard everything she whispered. I nodded. "Good. You needed to." She wiped her tears. "He's really gone, isn't he?" "For now," I said. "And if he comes back, the law will greet him before I do." She looked at me, searching for something in my face. "How did you stay so calm?" I sat beside her and smiled faintly. When you've lived long enough, you learn that anger burns fast, but patience burns clean. She let out a shaky breath and rested her head on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mom, for not believing you sooner, for everything." I stroked her hair gently. "Don't be sorry, just be free." We sat like that for a long time, the quiet of the house wrapping around us like a blanket. Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle, the sound like applause from the heavens. Before going to bed, I returned downstairs one last time. The house was dim, the fireplace glowing faintly. I stood in the center of the room where the dinner table had once been, where the glass had shattered, where my silence had died. I whispered to the empty space, "You wanted to make me small, Mark. But you forgot that roots grow underground. The deeper the cut, the stronger the tree." Then I turned off the lights and went upstairs, each step steady, deliberate, final. That night, I dreamed of my husband again. He was standing in the garden, the sun warm on his face. He turned to me and said, "You kept your promise, Dolores. You built her a home worth living in." When I woke, there were no tears, only the quiet certainty that something had ended and something better was waiting to begin. Downstairs, the morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. Elena was making breakfast, humming to herself. For the first time in years, her song sounded free. And as I poured my coffee, I realized that the true revenge was never in the papers, or the recordings, or even the humiliation. It was in this moment, peace earned and unshakable. Mark had lost everything he could touch. I had regained everything he couldn't destroy. 3 days passed before the world caught up with what had already happened inside our home. The air itself seemed to carry the residue of unfinished storms. The newspapers whispered about Mark's financial collapse, his company's internal review, the investors backing away like men who had finally smelled smoke after years of silence. Elena hadn't gone to work since that night. She moved slowly like someone relearning how to exist. I didn't press her. Healing has its own schedule. Some mornings she helped me in the garden, her hands trembling, but steadying a little more each day. I could see it in her eyes, the dawning realization that she was not powerless, that she'd survived something she couldn't yet name. But peace, as I knew too well, never lasts long when a man like Mark feels cornered. It was a Friday afternoon when the knock came again, softer this time. Not at my door, but at the door of the local courthouse. "James called me that evening. He's filed a complaint," he said. "Claims you manipulated the estate through undue influence. Says you're not mentally competent to manage your assets." I laughed, a short, dry sound. "He's accusing me of being senile now." "Exactly. It's desperate," James said. "But it means there will be a hearing, if you're up for it." "Oh, I'm more than up for it," I said. "Let's give him the audience he's been craving." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Word spread fast. Small towns always run on gossip faster than electricity. By the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were lined with familiar faces pretending they just happened to pass by. Reporters hovered with cameras. I could almost hear their headlines forming: "Wealthy Widow versus Ambitious Son-in-Law, Inheritance War Turns Ugly." When Elena and I arrived, the air buzzed with whispers. She clutched my arm tightly. "Mom, are you sure about this?" I smiled at her. "Sweetheart, I was sure the moment he threw that glass." Inside, the courtroom smelled of wood polish and nervous sweat. Mark was already there, sitting beside his lawyer. He looked thinner, Sharper, the kind of thin that comes from hunger, not for food, but for control. When our eyes met, he smiled like a man who thought he'd found one last card to play. The judge entered a stern woman with gray hair tied tightly back. "We're here regarding the petition filed by Mr. Mark Alvarez," she said, glancing at the paperwork, "alleging that Mrs. Dolores Alvarez has acted under diminished capacity in matters relating to her estate." I could feel the room lean forward, collective curiosity hanging in the air. Mark's lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, stood and began his performance. "Your Honor, my client only seeks fairness. Mrs. Alvarez, while clearly a respected woman, has recently made erratic financial decisions, selling properties, transferring ownership of assets without consulting her family. We have reason to believe she's being manipulated by outside parties." He paused for effect, then added, "We also have medical notes suggesting memory decline." Elena gasped beside me. I remained perfectly still. "Medical notes," I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Mark's lawyer nodded smugly. "Yes, from her primary care physician." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's interesting, because I haven't seen a doctor in 3 years." The judge's eyebrow arched. "Mr. Fisher, do you have documentation of this alleged evaluation?" The lawyer hesitated. "We are in the process of obtaining it." Translation, I said lightly, "It doesn't exist." A ripple of laughter broke through the courtroom before the judge banged her gavel once. "Order." Mark's lawyer glared at me. "Mrs. Alvarez, perhaps you can explain the sudden changes to your estate." "With pleasure," I said. I rose slowly, each movement deliberate, the room's attention following me like gravity. For 35 years, I and my late husband worked to build the home that stands in dispute today. It was never a gift. It was never a loan. It was ours. My husband's wish was for that home to remain in our family, cared for with respect. I paused, letting the words sink in. After his death, I allowed my daughter and her husband to live there rent-free. In exchange, I expected only gratitude and decency. Instead, I was met with insults, humiliation, and eventually violence. Mark's lawyer jumped up. "Objection. There's no evidence of violence." I turned my head slowly toward him. "There is." James stood and produced a small envelope from his briefcase. "Your Honor," he said, "this contains video footage recorded by a neighboring security camera. It clearly shows Mr. Alvarez throwing a glass in Mrs. Alvarez's direction during a family gathering, followed by verbal aggression." The lawyer's face drained of color. "That's unlawfully obtained?" The judge adjusted her glasses. "Public street footage is admissible. Proceed." James inserted the drive into the court monitor. The screen flickered, and then there it was, the dining room frozen in time, the laughter fading, the tension rising, the glass sailing through the air, the red stain spreading on the wall like spilled blood, my calm face standing amid the chaos. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the speakers. When the footage ended, I heard someone whisper in the gallery, "My God." Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is taken out of context," he shouted. "She provoked me. She's been undermining me for years." "Sit down, Mr. Alvarez," the judge said sharply. He froze, breathing, hard eyes darting from the judge to the cameras, realizing too late that his temper was proving my case for me. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Alvarez, would you like to add anything further?" I nodded. "Only this, Your Honor. I may be old, but I am not weak. I may be quiet, but I am not blind. For years, I tolerated disrespect in the name of peace. But peace built on silence is nothing but surrender. So yes, I made decisions to protect what my husband built, to protect my daughter, and to protect myself." I looked at Mark then, not with anger, but with the kind of pity that comes from seeing someone completely undone. "You accused me of losing my mind, Mark, but the only thing I've lost is my tolerance for cruelty." The judge cleared her throat. "I've heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, I find no merit to Mr. Alvarez's claim. In fact, I would caution him against further legal harassment of Mrs. Alvarez, or this court will consider sanctions." There was an audible gasp from the audience. Mark sank back into his chair, his face gray. The gavel came down, case dismissed. As the courtroom erupted in whispers, I gathered my papers calmly. James smiled at me with quiet pride. "You handled that like a queen," he said under his breath. "Queens don't raise their voices," I replied. "They just raise the truth." As I turned to leave, I caught sight of Mark's reflection in the polished courtroom glass. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Elena, who stood a few steps behind me. She met his eyes, her face pale but resolute. Then slowly she shook her head and walked past him without a word. That was the moment he truly broke. Outside, the reporters swarmed. Microphones appeared, voices shouted questions. "Mrs. Alvarez, how does it feel to win?" one of them called out. I paused on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind tugging at my hair, and said, "It's not about winning. It's about remembering who you are when someone tries to erase you." They scribbled that down, but I didn't wait for follow-ups. Elena and I walked toward the car in silence. The crowd parted around us like waves making way for a tide they couldn't resist. When we reached home, she turned to me, her voice trembling. "Mom, the way you spoke in there. I don't think I've ever seen you like that." I smiled faintly. "That's because you've never seen me free." That night, the story spread like wildfire. The video leaked online, shared, reshared, dissected. Headlines filled with words like "courage," "justice woman reclaims dignity." Messages poured into my inbox from strangers, women who had stayed silent for years, thanking me for reminding them they weren't powerless. By the weekend, Mark's company announced his resignation. The official statement said personal reasons. Everyone knew what that meant. He left town a few days later. No goodbye, no apologies, just gone like a storm that finally realized it couldn't win against the mountain it tried to destroy. Elena and I watched the moving truck pull away from the house he once called his. She slipped her hand into mine. "Do you think he'll ever change?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," I said, "but it won't be our responsibility if he does." We stood there for a long time, the afternoon light stretching across the yard, painting everything gold. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt like ours again, solid, honest, alive. That evening, Clara came over with a bottle of wine. For celebration, she said, grinning. I laughed softly. "If anyone deserves to throw a glass tonight, it's me." She raised her glass, to new beginnings. We drank, and the laughter came easily this time. No bitterness, no tension, just the sound of peace returning home. Later, after everyone left, I stepped out onto the porch. The night was clear, the air cool. I could see the faint shimmer of stars reflected in the windows of my house, the same house my husband and I built with love, the same house I nearly lost to pride and silence. I whispered to the wind, "We did it, love. We kept our promise." And as the breeze moved through the trees, I could almost hear his voice. Again, soft and steady, "You didn't just win Dolores. You reminded the world that dignity has no expiration date." I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next storm. I was standing in the calm, knowing I'd earned every second of it. The video didn't just end Mark's career. It started a conversation, a wave, a fire that spread far beyond our quiet street. Within 24 hours, the clip had been shared across social media, then picked up by national news outlets. Headlines appeared one after another. Elderly woman confronts abusive son-in-law and wins. Some called it the glass that didn't break. Others named it the dinner that changed everything. At first, I didn't want to read the comments. I'd lived long enough to know how cruel strangers could be. But one evening, Elena sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Mom, you need to see this," she said. She showed me messages from women across the country, grandmothers, mothers, daughters, all saying the same thing in different words. "You gave me courage." One woman wrote, "I watched my daughter suffer for years in silence. I thought I couldn't help her. Then I saw your story. Tomorrow, I'm going to her house." Another said, "I left my abusive husband today. You were the last push I needed." My eyes blurred. I had never thought of myself as brave. I was just a woman who had been pushed too far. But somehow, that small act of defiance had become a beacon for others. Even Clara was caught off guard by how far it reached. "Dolores," she said one morning, holding up her tablet, "you're trending." "Is that good or bad?" I asked dryly. She grinned. "Depends on whether you like fame, because right now half the country wants to interview you." I waved it off. Let them talk. I've done enough talking for one lifetime. But the fire didn't die. Reporters showed up at the end of our street filming segments in front of my house. The mayor's office sent a letter praising my courageous stand for justice and dignity. A local shelter for abused women asked if they could name a room after me. It was surreal, almost absurd. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I declined every interview, every television offer, because this story wasn't about fame. It was about reclaiming what silence had stolen from so many women like me. Still, the attention had one unexpected effect. Witnesses began to speak. The guests who had been at that dinner started coming forward, first privately, then publicly. One woman, a friend of Mark's business partner, posted on social media, "I was there. I saw what he did." Dolores never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm was louder than his rage. Her post went viral, drawing even more attention. Soon others joined in, people who had known Mark in his professional life, recounting the arrogance, the temper, the manipulation. His carefully constructed image collapsed overnight. James called me a few days later, amused and proud. "Dolores," he said, "you've managed what most lawyers only dream of: total destruction, without a single lawsuit." I laughed softly. Justice doesn't always need a courtroom, James. Sometimes it just needs witnesses. Elena was beginning to heal too. She spent more time outside, volunteering at the local women's shelter. She told me she wanted to help other women rebuild their lives. "I used to think strength meant staying," she said one afternoon as we planted new roses in the garden. "Now I know it means leaving." I nodded, and sometimes it means rebuilding without bitterness. We worked in silence for a while, the scent of fresh soil and rain filling the air. For the first time, the house felt alive again. Every flower bed, every open window seemed to breathe differently, freer. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The return address was from the local police department. For a moment, my stomach tightened, thinking it was another complaint from Mark. But when I opened it, I found something else entirely: a formal apology from the department for not acting sooner when reports of domestic disturbances were made by neighbors months before. The letter ended with a handwritten note from the chief. "Your story has changed how we handle domestic abuse reports. Thank you for forcing us to see what we ignored." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my husband's old wooden box next to his war medals and our wedding photo. "You'd have liked this one," I whispered. "Justice that doesn't need applause." A few days later, Clara stopped by again, breathless from excitement. "You won't believe this," she said. "They're organizing a community talk about elder respect and domestic dignity, and they want you to speak." I shook my head. "Clara, I'm not a speaker." "Dolores," she said firmly, "you already spoke. The whole world listened. Now it's your turn to guide." I hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a crowd made my stomach twist. But then I thought about the messages, the women who had found strength in my story, the ones still living in silence. "Fine," I said finally, "but I'll do it my way." The event took place at the community center, a small hall filled with folding chairs and soft lighting. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need to. When I stood at the podium and looked at the faces in front of me, young and old, tired and hopeful, I simply told the truth. I am not a hero I began. I am not special. I am just a woman who decided to stop apologizing for existing. I told them about the years of small humiliations that built into one violent moment, about the power of evidence, about how dignity doesn't fade. With age, it deepens. I told them that forgiveness and silence are not the same thing. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then one by one, people began to stand and clap. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, respectful, full of understanding. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 25. "My mom's been living with a man like him," she said softly. "She's scared to leave, but after tonight, I think she will." I placed my hand over hers. "Tell her this kindness is a virtue, not a weakness. And when someone mistakes it for weakness, that's when she must remember who she is." That night, as Elena and I walked home, she said, "Mom, do you realize you've become a symbol?" I smiled at the moonlight falling across the quiet street. Symbols fade, stories live longer. I just hope they remember mine as a story of peace, not anger. When we reached the porch, Clara waved from across the street. "Dolores," she shouted, "the world finally caught up to you." I laughed softly. Took them long enough. We went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in decades, I didn't lock it out of fear. I locked it out of habit. The house was safe again, not because it was mine, but because it no longer echoed with lies. Justice, I learned, doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly disguised as ordinary days that don't hurt anymore. It had been 2 months since the hearing. The cameras were gone, the reporters had found new stories, and the world had moved on. But inside, my home, peace had decided to stay. The mornings were soft again. Elena laughed more often. The air no longer felt like we were waiting for something to break. Mark had vanished from our lives entirely. At first there were whispers, rumors from old colleagues, bits of gossip that traveled through Clara or James. His company had officially terminated him for conduct unbecoming of an executive. The investors filed civil suits. His reputation collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. Then came the stories of the fallout creditors knocking on doors. Luxury cars repossessed the penthouse apartment he'd rented under another name, emptied overnight. He had left town, they said, heading west. No forwarding address, no trace. I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, almost sacred stillness. I thought I might hate him forever, but when you finally see someone stripped of their arrogance, there's no room left for hate, only pity. One afternoon, as I was pruning roses in the garden, Clara came by wiping sweat from her brow. You heard she asked, her tone hesitant. Heard what? Mark. He's been seen in another city, working at a small car dealership using his middle name. I looked at her, then at the rose in my hand. Then let him sell cars, I said softly. Maybe now he'll learn what real work feels like. Clara gave a half smile. You really have moved on, haven't you? I nodded. Holding anger is like holding broken glass. The tighter you grip it, the more it cuts. The weeks that followed were full of small human victories. Elena found her footing again. She started therapy, began working part-time at the women's shelter, and soon became a counselor for others. Watching her sit across from women who reminded her of who she used to be, it was like seeing a wound turn into a scar, something permanent but no longer painful. Every evening, we had dinner together. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes we didn't. But one night, over a quiet meal, she asked me, "Do you ever think he'll call?" I thought for a long moment. He might, I said, but that doesn't mean we have to answer. That same night, James came by to drop off a few papers. Everything's wrapped up, he said. The trust, the estate all finalized. Legally, you and Elena are protected. He can't touch a thing. I thanked him. You've been a good friend, James. He smiled. You've been your own best lawyer, Dolores. I just watched you win. After he left, I went upstairs and sat by the window. The street was quiet, the world outside lit by the dim glow of the lamppost. I thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. People still whispered about our stories sometimes, but the noise was fading. The world forgets quickly. That's its curse and its mercy. A few days later, a letter arrived. No return address postmarked from another state. The handwriting was unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Dolores, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to do. You were protecting her, protecting both of us in a way I was too proud to see. I lost everything, but maybe that's what I needed. I hope Elena is happy. Take care of her. Mark, I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. For a moment I felt something close to peace. For him too, not redemption, but recognition. Sometimes understanding is the only apology the world can give. That evening, I took the letter outside and placed it under a small stone by the roses. The wind brushed against my cheek, gentle and forgiving. Rest in your own silence, I whispered. You've already taken enough of mine. Life after that became simple, beautifully so. Elena and I planted new flowers, repainted the walls, reopened windows that had been shut for years. The house no longer felt like a monument to pain. It was a home again. One Sunday morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, Elena brought 2 cups of coffee to the table. "Do you ever miss him, Mom?" she asked quietly. I took a sip, tasted the warmth, and said I missed the person I thought he could be. But the truth, I don't miss the noise. She smiled a small, tender smile that carried more relief than sadness. Later that afternoon, we walked down to the community center where the shelter was hosting a new program. They had named it Project Dignity. The plaque at the entrance read, "Dedicated to those who found their voice after being silenced, inspired by Dolores Alvarez." I stopped in front of it, breath-catching. "They didn't have to do that," I murmured. Elena slipped her arm around me. "Yes, they did." Inside, the air buzzed with laughter and chatter, women of all ages working together, their voices strong, their eyes bright. It was strange and beautiful, realizing that my story had rippled out into something larger than me. That night, as we walked home under the orange glow of the setting sun, I thought about my husband again, about the promise I made at his grave to keep our family whole, to protect what mattered. I hadn't saved the picture-perfect version of family I once imagined. I'd saved something more, real, the truth. When we reached home, I paused at the front steps and looked back at the horizon. "It's over," I said softly. Elena squeezed my hand. "No, Mom, it's just beginning." And maybe she was right. Because endings, when they're honest, don't close doors. They open them to the kind of peace that doesn't have to be fought for anymore. I stepped inside, shut the door behind me, and let the quiet wrap around me, not the silence of fear, but the silence of freedom. Morning light spilled softly through the curtains, the kind of golden light that makes even silence feel alive. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, listening to the wind weave through the open window. It had been months since the night everything changed, and yet the memory didn't hurt anymore. It felt distant, like a dream that used to burn, but now only glowed faintly, reminding me that pain too has its afterlife. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the old kind of quiet, the fearful kind. The silence was warm, peaceful, the kind you earn after years of holding your breath and finally exhaling. Outside, Elena was tending to the roses. They'd bloomed brighter this season, thick with color, defiant and proud. I like to think they understood me. Every thorn a memory of pain, every petal a victory. I thought back to that night. The dinner, the glass, the storm, the courtroom. Every moment that had once felt like breaking now felt like becoming. Sometimes the universe doesn't destroy you when it takes things away. It just clears the noise so you can hear yourself again. I walked outside to join her. The sunlight fell gently on her hair as she knelt among the flowers. She looked up at me with a smile that finally reached her eyes. "They're thriving," she said. "So are we," I replied. We worked side by side, trimming dead leaves, watering new buds. It was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt full of healing, of forgiveness of beginnings. At one point, Elena straightened up and looked at me. "Do you ever regret any of it, Mom?" The way it all happened. I wiped my hands on my apron and thought carefully. Regret, no. I regret the years I kept quiet, but not the moment I stopped. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "You changed everything, Mom." I smiled. "No, sweetheart, I just reminded us both that dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you protect." Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with a notebook. I'd started writing again, not stories, not plans, just thoughts, reflections, the kind of words you write not to be read, but to remember. On the first page, I wrote, "It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose peace. And it's never too late to walk away from people who mistake your kindness for weakness." As I wrote, I realized that what happened wasn't just about me or Mark or even Elena. It was about every woman who's ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, every mother who's ever endured cruelty disguised as love, every person who's ever chosen silence, believing it was strength. The truth is, silence can be sacred, but not when it hides pain. Real peace is loud. It demands honesty. It shakes walls and forces truth into the light. In the evenings, I often walk through the neighborhood. People greet me differently now. Some nod respectfully. Some smile quietly. Others stop to talk to, thank me to tell me they watched the video or read about the trial. One man, a stranger, once said, "My mother saw you on the news. She left her husband last month. Said your story gave her courage." I thanked him and kept walking the air thick with humility. It's a strange feeling realizing that your pain became someone else's permission to heal. At sunset, Elena joined me on the porch. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You think he'll ever come back?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "And if he does, he'll find there's nothing left here for him to break." We sat there as the sun dipped below the trees, painting the sky in gold and rose. The light caught on the windows of our home, warm and forgiving. "You know, I said after a while your father once told me something I didn't understand until now. He said a storm doesn't destroy a tree with deep roots." I think he was right. She smiled. "You're the strongest tree I know." I chuckled quietly. "No, I just learned how to bend without breaking." When the stars began to appear, she went inside to make dinner. I stayed out a little longer, looking at the darkening sky, feeling the soft pulse of the world around me. Somewhere, I thought that there were other women standing in their gardens too, some still waiting for courage, some already free. And maybe, just maybe, they'd hear my voice through the quiet and know they weren't alone. I turned to the camera on my porch table, the one Clara had convinced me to set up for my storytelling project. I pressed record. "My name is Dolores." I began, my voice calm and steady. "I'm 66 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm free." I let that sit for a moment before continuing. Freedom doesn't come from running away. It comes from standing still and saying enough. It comes from remembering who you were before someone convinced you to forget. I looked straight into the lens, the same way I had looked at Mark that night, and said softly, "If you're watching this, and you've been told you're too old, too tired, too small to start over, believe me, you're not. Dignity doesn't age. Strength doesn't fade. And peace is worth every battle it takes to earn it." I paused, then smiled faintly. "So tell me, what would you do if someone threw a glass at you? Your silence, your pride, your heart. Would you stay seated? Or would you stand up, walk away, and take back your life?" I leaned forward, slightly voice low, intimate. "Comment 1 if you'd stand up, and like this, if you believe peace is stronger than fear." I stopped the recording, sat back, breathed. In the distance, I could hear Elena humming in the kitchen, the sound drifting through the open window like a lullaby. For the first time in a long time, everything felt as it should, quiet, safe, alive. I picked up my coffee and whispered into the night, "This is what freedom sounds like." And the wind carried my words away over the garden, across the rooftops, into the hearts of anyone still waiting for their own moment to stand up and say enough.